Today's shir is sponsored by Captain and Mrs. Bruce Public and also Rabbi Yaakov and Mrs. Lisa Traeger, L'Zecher Nishmas Yaakov's father, Neshama Shadam and Aliyah. We thank them for sponsoring. As we mentioned in the past more than once, so Tisha B'Av, we know we're forbidden to learn Torah. Really, Tisha B'Av in general is time, honestly, for stories. I mean, stories of Jewish history. Really, the keynotes themselves are historical stories, historical events, sad events. Being precluded from learning Torah, perhaps it's a proper time to review events of Jewish history. Today's lecture is going to be about the rescue of Entebbe, and although the story hopefully is more upbeat than other times, and perhaps even more known than other times, but perhaps the events that we're in, perhaps we need a little bit more of an upbeat story. But B, when I spoke about Ma'alot, when I spoke a couple of weeks back about the massacre of Ma'alot, and which was the 50th anniversary that took place in 1974, I realized that unless you're in 60 years old or so or something like that, you probably do not remember the Entebbe rescue, at least not firsthand, that it was 48 years ago. Even though actually in the course of my research I realized that it's been made into more than one motion picture, many motion pictures, and my hunch tells me that probably people have, in one way or another, are familiar with the story. But nevertheless, I think particularly what's going on right now in the state of affairs in Israel, with over 115 or so hostages still being held captive, and Hashem Yisbarach should allow them to be free. But honestly, even that entire episode is something which is a controversial issue. When people here in America, even Jews or Mr. Biden or whoever, say free the hostages, are we exactly on the same page in what we mean free the hostages also? Obviously, as we've discussed in the past, there are halachas about when exactly hostages should be freed, and therefore I figured 48 years later this would be an appropriate topic. I'm going to begin by reading from you a article which appeared, if this is the 48th year, this appeared 3 years ago, I guess in 2021, commemorating the 45th anniversary of the Entebbe raid in one of the Jewish publications. It says like this, it begins the following. It says, the basic facts are these. On June 27th, an Air France plane was hijacked by two Palestinians from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and two Germans from the Revolutionary Cell, a fringe leftist terrorist group. They had the plane flown to Uganda, having received the support of the country's dictator Idi Amin, released all non-Israeli and non-Jewish passengers, save for the flight crew and a few others who decided to remain with the Jewish hostages in Entebbe airport. Hijackers demanded the release of 53 pro-Palestinian terrorists and $5 million in exchange for the hostages. In the days that followed, Israel security services, that goes on to talk about how basically that the raid took place. Just one other paragraph. A Mercedes sedan similar to the one used by Amin was brought along. Shortly after landing, however, things went south. As a Ugandan soldier apparently saw the Mercedes was black, not the white model that Amin was using. Firefight broke out. Yoni Netanyahu's commander was fatally wounded. So what's interesting to me when, this I realized after I was doing my research, but the even seemingly banal and non-controversial paragraph, such as this one, which says, the basic facts are these, which I imagine most of you here have some familiarity with the subject we're discussing. as we'll see, that these basic facts are anything but basic facts. There are a number of potential inaccuracies which was presented, and that's going to be part of the lecture today, is to try to ascertain what happened, and perhaps also at the end try to take some lessons that perhaps we can take with us. So let's begin. I do want to point out, just to clarify for everybody, the older I get, the more I realize, even sometimes in the newspaper, I'll have a politician will speak, etc., and they'll say, well, let's fact check this, let's fact check this. And too often I wonder if the ones who are fact checking, they have to be fact checked themselves. I mean, what does that mean to be fact checked? There's no some sort of, the only person who can fact check obviously is the Kadosh Baruch Hu. There's no some sort of body of literature or body of information that's securely stored away somewhere in Washington, D.C., which contains all facts. And what exactly does facts mean anyway? In another venue, and I don't mean this in a comical way, but I do mean in the serious way, perhaps one of the greatest facts that people will say was that 1 + 1 = 2. But honestly, even that, is that really factually true? If I may use an example, if you're doing laundry, and you do, not today, after tomorrow, after Chatzos, people will be doing laundry. And you take a pile of laundry from the washing machine at 3 o'clock and you put it on the bed. You have a pile of laundry, and then you do another load of laundry at 3 o'clock after the 2 o'clock load, and you put that on the bed. So right now at 4 o'clock, how many piles of laundry do I have on the bed? So I have 2 piles of laundry on the bed, meaning 1 and 1, 2 piles of laundry. What happens if I go ahead and then I decide now it's time to fold the laundry, and I take the 2 piles and I put them one on top of the other in a basket and I bring them upstairs? Well, how many piles of laundry do I have now? I really still have 1 pile of laundry, meaning even though I took 2 piles of laundry, no one would say I'm carrying 2 piles of laundry. So maybe, does that prove 1 + 1 doesn't = 2? I don't know, but what I do know is that memory, the older I get, the more I realize that memory is certainly, we have this misconception, which has been honestly not the venue, but there have been books written on this and other things. Memory is not what we used to think it was, that some sort of recording of events, some sort of video recording of events in exactual, precise fashion. More and more, even police work, who for years and generations, an eyewitness account was always considered an extremely accurate. They're becoming less and less. Lineups, etc., are less and less accurate than people thought. But more importantly, honestly, memories change. And contrary to what we believe, what we can remember an event, or we're sure we can remember an event 10 years ago, 20 years ago, as years goes on, that's just not how the mind works. So therefore, again, I don't want to present, or I don't want to be under the false impression that I, Ron Yitzchak Eisman, have gathered the true facts of the story of Entebbe, and only I have gathered the true facts. I don't want to imply that in the least. However, and hopefully at the end we'll make usage of it, but I would like to suggest that some of the quote-unquote the basic facts are anything but basic facts. One thing is for sure, is that the events which occurred on July 4th, 1976, the bicentennial of the United States' declaration, or the establishment of the United States, our bicentennial celebration, certainly to this day is celebrated or remains in our minds as one of the greatest, and frankly, probably in anti-terrorist history, as one of the most successful acts against terrorist activity. And the story is certainly worthy of being told. But nevertheless, we'll try to analyze it as we move on. So let's begin from the beginning. We begin on the 29th of Sivan in the year 1976, 5736, corresponding to the English date of June 27th, Sunday, June 27th, 1976. The next day, Monday, would be last day of Sivan, or first day Rosh Chodesh Tammuz, and Tuesday the 29th was the first of Tammuz. So on that day, 9 o'clock, 8:59 exactly, an Air France flight number 139 took off from Ben Gurion Airport on its way to France, to Paris, France. It had approximately 230, 240 passengers. Again, from my research, and happened to be I didn't research what this means, but from my research, they record that it made an unscheduled landing in Athens. I'm not sure exactly, perhaps I've never, certainly in the last 20, 30 years, I've never got to the airport where I was announced that unless there's trouble on the plane, that on the airport they tell you that the plane is now going somewhere else in between. I don't know, maybe in 1976 that was it. I'm not sure exactly what they mean unscheduled. But the people before they boarded the plane were informed that although they had bought direct tickets, Tel Aviv, Paris, before they boarded the plane, for whatever the reason, is beyond me, but for whatever the reason, perhaps that was the norm back then, they were informed that the plane would make an unscheduled stopover in Athens. Now, already by the 1970s, hijacking had become very popular. More popular was in the 1960s, where in the 1960s, where those of us who are old enough to remember, in the early 70s, people would hijack planes to Cuba. And that seemed to be, in fact, a joke about that was that if you fly certain American Airlines or Pan Am, our pilots are very seasoned. They even still remember the old routes from Florida to Cuba, so if you get hijacked, don't worry, we know the route very well. But almost all of those hijackings which took place were not for political, they were either political statements, but they had nothing to do with hostage taking. And almost in all those cases, Cuba would just eventually send the plane back with the people were released immediately. Rabbi Yisrael Feuerman, who we were privileged to hear, I don't know, privileged, but we heard Megillas Eicha, privileged to hear from him, Megillas Eicha last night, and he lay today at Shacharis. His father was actually hijacked to Cuba. His wife, Ruchama Feuerman, if you're interested, you can look it up on H.com. She wrote about the 17, 18-hour ordeal he had being hijacked to Cuba, but these were not hostage-taking. However, obviously, in the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict, we're well aware of the fact that that the Arabs tried very hard to do whatever harm they could to the state of Israel and Jewish people, and hostage-taking was unfortunately common. For the most part, though, the hostage-taking that was going on up to that point, not totally, but the hostage-taking was going on, had to do within Israel itself. Most notably, we talked about in 1974 in Ma'alot, where about 100 students were taken hostage in a school in Ma'alot from a high school in Tzfat, which resulted in a horrific massacre of over 20 students, I think 20 or 22 students being murdered, and out of the 86 students who were in the room at the time, I think only 2 came out, or none came out totally unscathed. A few months after that, Arabs took also hostages in Kiryat Shmona, which also ended in a botched attempt to free them, and also Israelis, Jewish people were killed. Most notably, also in the early 70s, the Arabs actually using Japanese terrorists, at least one Japanese terrorist had a horrific murder at that time. That was the most horrific terrorist attack, that at Lod Airport they took out weapons and they started shooting. Most of the people killed were Christian pilgrims, Latino Christian pilgrims. And therefore, and the famous incident, the Sabina jet, which was diverted from Belgium to Tel Aviv, also in the, whatever it was, 73, 4, 5, I forget exactly, but that was involved Benjamin Netanyahu. That's apparently when that's when he got injured. He was one of the, being a member of Sayeret Makal, Israel's sort of equivalent to Navy SEALs unit, Special Forces unit, stormed the plane, which was successful there. They successfully captured or killed all the terrorists. But the idea of taking hostages on planes was certainly a fear, and the way it's recorded. One thing I want to state right from the start: there obviously are many books written on Entebbe. Most, and I've read more than a few. However, the book that this lecture is mostly based on, is primarily based on, is the most recent book. This is a book called Operation Thunderbolt, which was written by Saul David. And this was first published in 2015. So 2015, it's the most, I believe it's also the most recent book written on the subject. Most of the other books were written within the first, obviously, 2, 3, 4 years of 1976, because obviously that's when it sold the most. His book written in 2015, so sort of, I guess, to a certain extent, commemorated that almost, whatever, those years. So I guess in certain ways it contains within it all the information of previous books, but again, I certainly don't claim that, I have no reason to claim that this book is the final word on the entire incident. There were for the most part, people, when they were informed that the plane would be have this unscheduled flight into Athens, people were concerned. Again, I have to admit publicly, it's still not understandable to me why, honestly, until after 9/11, why was it so difficult, or why was it so easy to hijack planes? It seems to be something like, even what they do now, after 9/11 obviously it's very time-consuming, et cetera, but it seems to work. There really haven't been, I don't think that many planes hijacked, if anything, since 9/11. But why exactly many planes were hijacked up to that? Why in 1976 planes were still easily being hijacked, I don't understand. And that's really what happened over here. 58 passengers, some got off, but 58 passengers got on in Athens. And back then, it was that if you had come from a connecting flight to at least in Athens, that was the very unprofessional and unsecure protocol, was that the Athens airport, and apparently this was known to people. If the information in the book is right, there were people who expressed extreme surprise to the extent that it was going, and some of them wanted to go ahead, and some of them didn't even want to board the flight. But nevertheless, it made this on schedule, and there were passengers who flew from Singapore to Bahrain, and from Bahrain, and they went to Athens. And the assumption was that their luggage was checked prior to that, and being that was as such, these people, at least 4 people boarded the plane in Athens who were terrorists. There were 2 Palestinian, 2 Arab terrorists on board, and 2 Germans on board. So just a little context of what we're dealing with now, because this unfortunately is different the way than it is nowadays. And that's the following. The group responsible for the kidnapping and the groups responsible for this whole thing was called the PFLP, the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine. What's interesting about and this is so different than it is nowadays, but the PFLP was run by a man who's not even a Muslim. He's not even a Muslim. His name was Wadi Haddad, and Wadi Haddad was basically the same person, by the way, involved in Ma'alot, more or less. But him and a fellow named George Habash, who also was not a Muslim. Both of these were Christian Arabs. Both of them actually were physicians, doctors. I think they both went to the university, the American University of Beirut. Both of these were medical doctors, and both of them were leftists, meaning they were communists for the most part. They were communists. They weren't religious. They were secular people. It wasn't at all like some sort of jihad holy war, because they weren't Muslims to begin with. George Habash, the fellow who he died of a ripe old age in his 80s, I think in Lebanon maybe 20 years ago, he actually began this PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And to this day, I think it's part of Fatah, which is the officially, again, somewhat semi-secular group which governs, that's the Palestinian Authority, which governs the West Bank. Supposedly, it's the second largest faction in the Fatah, which is the Palestinian Authority guarding or running whatever civil authority there is. This fellow, though, Wadi Haddad, who was born in 1927 and dies in March of 1978. So like I mentioned, he was a physician, he was a Christian Arab. He was born in Sfat in 1927. And for the most part, maybe many of us don't realize, but it only was really with the rise of, honestly, with Muslim extremism, which obviously took place in its Shiite fashion in the Iranian Revolution in the late 1970s, when Khomeini comes in and Iran becomes a Shiite theocratic state. But at the time as well, or later, probably a little later on, in the 1980s, you find Sunni Muslims for the most part, by the way. I think something 90% of Muslims are Sunni Muslims, about 10% are Shiite Muslims. Hamas, for instance, they are Sunni Muslims, and really for many years the 6-year war between Iran and Iraq was actually a religious war between the Sunnis and the Shiites. But as we all know, when it's hatred of the Jews and of Israel, people make peace, as we saw in Parshas Balak with Midian and Moab, were able to make peace. So Hamas, even though they're supported by Iran, they're an Iranian-supported terrorist group, they are Sunni Muslims, as opposed to Hezbollah, which is, even though it's in Lebanon, it's mostly it's Shiite Muslims there, for the least because many of them are Syrian expats, and Syrian also has a Shiite population. But for the most part, the Muslim Brotherhood, which was a Sunni Islamic group which formed in Egypt, and they began to take over, obviously, in the West, especially in Gaza. But he wasn't a Muslim, he wasn't religious. And not only that, this Wadi Haddad, I've mentioned in the past in other shiurim, in 1970, the PFLP had this grand plan to hijack 4 planes to Jordan. The reason that's very well known to many of us here is because nobody less than Rabbi Yitzchak Kutner, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, was on one of those 4 planes. Plus, if you come from Brooklyn and you're familiar with the Chalabi Syrian community, the Raful brothers, I think Rav Avraham is no longer with us, but Rav Avraham and Yibadol Chaim Rav Yosef Raful, they were also hostages on one of those planes that were hijacked to Dawson Field in Jordan. So that was organized by Habash and the PFLP. It was an utter failure. It was a tremendous debacle. They really got nothing, and it led to what was called the Black September, when basically under American pressure, King Hussein of Jordan expelled the Palestinians from Jordan. Killed, by the way, he killed more Palestinians during the Black September of 1970, more than Israel has any ever killed. And at that point, the PFLP under George Habash decided that international hijacking was not the way to attack Israel, and they would limit itself to attacks within Israel. That would be the way to go. However, his former partner and assistant, Wadi Haddad, disagreed with him. He broke off, and he founded the PFLP, and then some people call it PFLP-CO, or PFLP SA, Special Operations, but he still believed that it would be good to go international and to involve other international terrorists in his means of, and he did not believe in a 2-state solution. He believed actually that Israel should be wiped off the map, but not to form an Islamic theocracy as, let's say, Hamas would want, or Hamas does want, but just the opposite. He wanted to form a secular state, a secular Arab state, left-leaning secular Arab state, as long as there are no Jews there. That was his goal. And therefore, being a left-wing communist, socialist communist, by the way, eventually more research has come out, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990, that it was revealed that he actually was a KGB agent, that Haddad was actually on the payroll of the KGB, and he was, unfortunately, certainly not a, according to Vaskil Mitrokin, a senior KGB archive who defected to the UK in 1992, Haddad was recruited by the KGB as an agent, codenamed Nationalist. Thereafter, in deep secrecy, the Soviets helped to fund and arm that part of the PFLP. And the reality was, he was behind this operation of hijacking this Airbus, this Air France Flight 139, when it left Tel Aviv, actually when it would, from the stop in Athens. So number one, he believed that hijacking involving not just Israeli property or Israeli on Israel would be the way to go. Two, and the reason I point this out is it's different nowadays too, he also believed this was some sort of worldwide movement. Now, even though we do have this idea nowadays of Israel being a colonial state, colonial power, and part of the oppressors, and the Arabs being the oppressed, which has similarity to the left-wing communist ideology, but even though it's Hamas is certainly a religious organization. But he had this belief that it would be an international, part of this international uprising. And therefore, he specifically partnered with this RC, which was called the Revolutionary Cell. The Revolutionary Cell was before Germany is reunited in 1989, 1990, it was a left-wing terrorist organization, probably the most prominent and most lethal left-wing terrorist organization operating in West Germany. And believe it or not, their belief was that West Germany, which is not totally untrue, but their belief was that since Germany incorporated or repatriated many ex-Nazis back into positions, which was true, meaning as long as they weren't radical Nazis, many people who served in civil positions during the Nazi era continued to serve, or whatever, were allowed to serve in West Germany's democratic state, frankly, as long as they weren't communists, because remember, Germany was split between the Americans, British, and France on the democratic or Western side, and East Germany aligned with the USSR. So he partnered with this RZ and two German terrorists, a man and a woman, a man named Bose and a woman, whatever it makes her name is not so critical, but they and two Arabs joined the flight in Athens. Their luggage was never checked. They came on board with very large pieces of luggage, which at least post facto, other passengers were very suspectful of what exactly is going on. And to the extent that one former passenger claims that when the Arab sat next to him, a little Jewish boy, asked the Arab, "What's in those big bags?" And he said, "Dates for you and grenades for your parents." Again, I can't obviously verify that, but 8 minutes or 10 minutes after takeoff, after these 58 passengers join the flight in Athens, they stand up and they take out their grenades and their guns. They break into the cockpit, and they demand, and they say, from now on, this plane is being called Haifa 1. We are representative of the PFLP, for the Palestinian Federation, whatever, liberation of Palestine, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And they hijacked the plane. They, after traveling for a while looking for a place, they eventually land in Benghazi. They land in Benghazi in Libya, where Muammar Gaddafi, who was certainly also no lover of Jews, he gives them permission to land. However, he just allows them to refuel. He doesn't. Nobody gets off the plane. Again, apparently they needed just fuel, and nevertheless, and they remain on the ground for about 7-8 hours in Benghazi. It's interesting to note that, and this is going to be a little bit important when we analyze exactly some of the, I think, myths of what exactly went on that day, is that there was one woman, an Israeli woman. She was actually originally from Manchester, England. She had made Aliyah. She was only recently married. She actually was going to the funeral of her mother. Her mother still lived in England, and her mother lived in Manchester. Her mother had passed away, and she was on her way from France to catch a plane to England to attend her mother's funeral. And interestingly enough, she decided that she is going to get off this plane no matter what, and she told the hijackers that she's having a miscarriage, and whatever, she did other things to indicate that she was indeed miscarrying her baby. Said she was in the early stages of pregnancy and she had to get off the plane. And even though it was a complete ruse, it worked. And the terrorists, who obviously they didn't want to have this pregnant woman miscarriage on the plane, certainly wouldn't have been, whatever, good for them. So they released her. Interestingly enough, I found later on when I was doing research, doesn't matter, I don't see it now, but she's a frum woman. She's a Jewish woman, she's a frum woman, and she was interviewed maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago about that, and she's, again, a frum woman and living, I think, whatever, Herzliya or Petach Tikva, something like that, and she was successful in convincing them that she had to get off the plane. It's interesting to note, in this interview, her name was, I think, Patricia something, I forget now, doesn't matter, but she actually told them she's kosher, and being that she was a British subject, she had the British ambassador for the British Council visited her, since she really was nothing wrong with her, and she was put up in a nice hotel overnight until the next morning. She caught a flight to London. She missed, I think, her mother's funeral, but she did get back to Manchester, and she's critical besides that she did get off the plane, but it's important because she was able to be the first person to already be debriefed by the Mossad, which will be critical as we move on, to get the situation as to what exactly is going on over here. The plane refuels. It takes about 7, 8 hours for the plane to refuel. We're still Monday the 28th. We're still Sunday the 27th. And then finally, after 7 hours, they fly off on Monday very early in the morning. Monday morning, they land in Entebbe, Uganda. They land in Entebbe Airport in Uganda, which is they say, the final destination. And that's when, pretty soon after they're off the plane, they are met by Idi Amin. Idi Amin, many of you probably have heard of, is whatever. I mean, talk about people who are a very, very unique individual. Although he's going to figure prominently, actually, and be part of our reasons for the success of the whole success of what happened, but he's a very unstable individual, to say the least. And he meets the plane and he tells them how everything is going to be fine. He's working to get them released, and they stay on the plane most of the day. Only towards the evening of Monday night, the 28th, they're allowed to disembark from the airplane, and they're taken to the old terminal. The old terminal, which functioned in the 1960s, and in the 1970s, a new terminal was built, and that's where they are taken, and these 200, whatever, 40 or 50 or whatever they are, people are taken to this old terminal, and the old terminal, that's when they're saying, we're going, hopefully you'll get off. And again, the terrorists have not yet even told what their demands are at this point. What's interesting to note, and frankly we're going to see this all along, and I just want to point this all along because how at the end we'll maybe draw some conclusions, but from the start of the hijacking, almost till the end, there were some, I guess we would say, notable exceptions, but for the most part, the hostages were never maltreated. Meaning in obviously very contradistinction to the events of October 7th, where literally we saw not just barbaric, but literally sadistic and frankly unbelievable acts of sadistic and barbaric behavior and cruelty to women, children, and elderly people. In all truth, the hostages not only were, for the most part, well treated, there were no incidents whatsoever of any women being in any way inappropriately touched. There was a couple of instances of men who they felt were Israeli part of the IDF who were maybe hit, roughed up, but again, nothing at all compared, or nothing in any way which would compare. Nobody was killed, nobody was permanently injured, nobody was really even tortured, which obviously is in contradistinction to, unfortunately, what we saw going on very clearly in October 7th. So the plane lands in Uganda, and initially, finally, they, at this point on Tuesday, the hostages, the terrorists, they released their demands. And here as well, in comparison with what we're familiar with lately, the demands are, I guess we would call them quite, quote unquote, modest, as what we would call. They want a total of 51 hostages released, 51 terrorist relief. They want 40, what's that? Okay. They want 40 from Israeli jails, 40 from Israeli jails they want released, 6 from West German jails, and 5 from Kenya, and 1 from Swiss, and 1 from France. And although some of the terrorists, there was the Japanese terrorist who had shot up Lode. He was one of the terrorists who they wanted released, who, by the way, would eventually be released a few years later in a different hostage negotiation. But again, compared to what we say nowadays, compared to certainly Gilad Shalit, the requests wasn't even a one-for-one. They were asking for, like I mentioned, a total of only 40 from Israeli jails. And not all of them, by the way, either had blood on their hands either. The most famous they wanted was Kozo Akamoto. Kozo Akamoto was the fellow who shot up Lode Airport. Like I said, he would be released a few years later, I think in the Jabal hostage release. Now, many of us are familiar with the idea that Israel has this policy of never negotiating with terrorists. It's not exactly accurate. The idea of hostage-taking and its efficacy in getting the results one wants, frankly, was demonstrated to us very clearly just 2 weeks ago. This fellow, Evan Garstrovich, whatever, of the Wall Street Jewish, who I'm certainly glad was saved, but the Wall Street Journal reporter who was imprisoned, obviously on false charges for spying for the United States in Russia for the last year and month or two, who was finally released in a hostage exchange. Basically, Putin very clearly wanted a convicted murderer. Putin had a fellow who he was one of his, an enemy of Putin, who was shot in broad daylight. This fellow, Putin, this Russian, Putin sent him to Germany to assassinate this fellow who was part of the, I think, one of the Chechen insurgents. He had him shot in broad daylight. This Czech from those insurgents. He was shot and he was sentenced to life imprisonment in Germany. So honestly, this fellow, it's not some sort of deal. Putin got what he wanted by taking an innocent person. The idea of taking innocent people and using them as bargaining chips to get non-innocent people, or to get innocent people freed, is still going on. And like I said, America also freed once for one fellow, I think was in Iran a few years back. They also released 5 terrorists. So the idea of hostage-taking is an old thing. In the idea that Israel never negotiates, again, that is certainly, I would imagine, not just Israel, I imagine other countries as well, first step or first trade, but it's not exactly true, which is why I just want to point out why this continues to this day. Unknown to probably everybody, it's probably one of the most unknown stories for many reasons, but in the summer of 1968, El Al Flight 426 took off from Rome International Airport en route to Tel Aviv with 38 passengers and 10 crew members. Minutes later, as the plane reached 33,000 feet, 3 members of the PFLP, the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, burst into the cockpit, struck First Officer Moaz Poraz in the head with a pistol, and ordered the plane to go from Israel to go to Algeria. And this story, which is sort of, it's hard even to get information on it, but Algeria initially, again, unfortunately, the old hijackers, the old terrorists weren't as brutal or as savage as today's. They released almost all the men and women very soon, and they kept, ultimately, I think only 12 or 15 or 21 men, Israeli men, no, just men. After they freed all the 9 Israelis, they freed all the Israeli women and children, and the 12 Israeli men stayed behind, which included crew members and some passengers. And honestly, as opposed to nowadays, this hostage standoff, which most of us never even heard of, actually went on for 40 days. For 40 days, these 12 Israelis remained hostage in Algeria, and ultimately, the Pilots Association of the World, or whatever that is, honestly said they would begin to boycott any flights to Algeria, and eventually they even threatened to not allow Algerians to fly on any other aircraft, which was kind of I can't imagine that nowadays, anybody doing that anymore. Eventually, though, however you want to doing so, they were able to negotiate a hostage release. And in doing so, Israel, again, did agree to release some Palestinian prisoners, and this was done eventually when all these negotiations was going on, and there were these threats of not allowing Algerians to fly either. So eventually on August 31st, 1968, 39 days after the forcible landing of Flight 426 in Algeria, the 12 Israeli men who had been taken hostage boarded a scheduled Alitalia flight from Algiers International to Rome, and from there they continued to Israel. 10 days later, after the all passengers and crew members returned home, Israel released 16 Arab prisoners from jails. And Israel portrayed this as a humanitarian. Israel made a special effort to portray the release not as a prisoner swap, but as a humanitarian gesture directed at the Italian authorities. That's why it took 10 days till they did it, and even not only all of them were not Palestinian. So, I mean, and obviously each side portrayed, or each side tried to spin that they were the success, that Israel said, look, we didn't give in to terrorism, we just in a humanitarian way, 10 days later we did release hostages, and obviously at that point having things repressed in the world press, I imagine, was easier. But nevertheless, for the PFLP, the 68 El Al hijacking achieved some tactical success. The group forced the relief of some hostages, and it did show them that, honestly, it did show them that there was possibility of Israel negotiating. So I do want to point out that the idea that Israel never negotiated, it's not really, it's myth. It is true that Israel certainly prefers not to negotiate. I imagine most countries, frankly, prefer not to negotiate for hostages when they can. But frankly, as obviously very notably with the case of Gilad Shalit, where Israel released over 1,000 murderers, many of them murderers, many of them with a lot of blood, the Sbarro bombers and others, Israel released them when Israel had no choice. Meaning, I think it's more accurate to say that Israel will go to greater lengths when possible to try to free hostages in a non-negotiated way of releasing Arab prisoners, but I think it's a falsehood to state that Israel never negotiates. I also want to point out, I think also factually, that as many times Israel has had success stories, I'm not sure that they also have had failures. We're going to be talking about a miraculous, again, I know you know the ending, so I don't have to say spoiler alert, but I'm sure you're all aware of the end of the story. But although Israel was successfully able to eventually fly over 1,000 miles, 2,000 miles, whatever it is, actually took off from Sharm el-Sheikh. At that point, Sharm el-Sheikh was still in Israeli hands, which was the most southern point from Israel to Africa. They were able to fly thousands of miles, kilometers, from Sharm el-Sheikh to Kampala, to Entebbe, to free the hostages. Only 2 years before, in a building in Israel where literally it was in their own backyard, they totally botched, which they could have released much less hostages. They totally botched the attempted rescue, which caused the death of 22 children. And in Kiryat Shmona, it was basically repeated about a month or two later. So, again, I think it's more accurate to say that Israel will attempt not to negotiate, and frankly, the reason being is, as the Mishnah says, you're not poda the shvuyim more than they're worth, for the fact that one of the reasons the Gemara says that people will start to kidnap people more and more, because once you pay off, they'll do it more and more. Obviously, we're still suffering that with the case of Gilad Shalit. Israel, I think, held off for 5 years, trying not to be poda him. Unfortunately, after the Islamic Spring, the Arab Spring, during the realm of Barack Obama, I think Israel felt that at the short time when the Muslim Brotherhood was in charge in Egypt, they would never get him back, which Israel agreed to that horrific, obviously, deal, which, again, we're still suffering to this day from. But nevertheless, it is correct to say that Israel certainly looked for, when possible, for some sort of alternate, or if possible, obviously, a military operation. So on Tuesday, the Arabs released, the terrorists released their demands, which, like I mentioned, is all these 50, whatever or so, hostages to be released. And Israel first says they're not going to negotiate, which certainly was the aura that Israel wanted to portray always to the world. For the next 3 days, beginning on Tuesday, considering until Friday, there's sort of this ongoing machlokas, interestingly enough, historically, between two figures who were tied together historically, although for most of their life, and they were tied together, even though they had a classical, very much so, love-hate, maybe more hate, but love-hate relationship for a long part of their lives, and that, of course, is Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin. Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin, who would remain basically connected at the hip until Rabin's assassination, and Peres obviously would go on to become the president of Israel, the elder statesman of the world. When he passes away, whatever it was, years ago, Obama flew to be maspid him in Israel, and he was, again, considered one of the great accolades, a peacemaker, a person who won the Nobel Peace Prize for signing the Oslo Accords, a proponent of the two-state solution. Historically, you should know that Shimon Peres, or Shimcha Peretsky, who was brought up, who was one of the last people that were alive who actually got a bracha for Arichas Yomim from the Chofetz Chaim himself, was brought up by his parents already had left religion. But his Zayda Paretsky, who was a Polish chassid who raised him, he had payas, he spoke only Yiddish, he was in Cheder. He himself admitted that when he was 10, 11 years old, and his parents already had left the fold for Zionism and non-religious and non-observant, that on one Shabbos he got fed up with his parents and he smashed the radio because they were listening to the radio on Shabbos Kodesh. So Shimon Peres was a hawk. He eventually, obviously, also left religion, and when he moves with his parents to Israel, his grandparents remain in Poland, where they suffer the fate of the majority of the Jews in Poland, ending up in Auschwitz and dead. But his parents at least go to Israel. He becomes a kibbutznik. But more than a kibbutznik, Shimon Peres actually had a very, very, very short stint in the IDF. He had never had combat duty, even though so many of the Israeli founders were known as their combat duty. Neither David Ben-Gurion nor Shimon Peres did. Even David Ben-Gurion was obviously older. But Shimon Peres was a master diplomat. I have to give credit where credit is due. He was a master diplomat. And honestly, he was, even though he was a left-wing part of Mapai, he was part of the Avodah, Marach, the Israeli Labor Party, the non-religious secular party, and he was, head of the party for many years. But he was a hawk, as far as even the left-wing politicians went. It's actually totally due to him, I don't know, maybe things were different, that Israel has nuclear weapons. He single-handedly, he was a fantastic diplomat. He single-handedly was the one who arranged for nuclear, whatever, uranium, whatever is needed but he set up Dimona. Dimona, Israel's famous top secret, never admitted, never confirmed nuclear facility in the south of Israel, in the Negev desert, is all attributed to Shimon Peres. And Shimon Peres was also, he is also the person who Israel, for many years, their high-tech plane was the Mirage. The Mirage, in 1967, it was the Mirage. Israel was not yet getting planes from the United States, not F-15s yet. It was the French-built Mirage that Shimon Peres bought, and he arranged all. He was a master diplomat and a master in obtaining arms for Israel. He was also staunchly hawkish in that from the beginning, when he heard about the hijacking, Rabin was the prime minister. Yitzhak Rabin was the prime minister. Shimon Peres was Minister of Defense, 1 and 2. And like nowadays, Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. He was Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin. He was steadfast that there has to be a military solution to this. And Yitzhak Rabin was not. Yitzhak Rabin, the military general, the man who ordered the firing, or who carried out Ben-Gurion's order to fire on the Alta Lena, on the beach in Tel Aviv that year in 48, 49. Yitzhak Rabin, the general, the chief of staff, he was very hesitant to he felt that it was impossible to get to Uganda to run any possibility. Nevertheless, Shimon Peres really on his own contacted a number of people, one of them Mata Gur. Mata Gur was the legendary chief of staff of the Israeli army at the time, Mata Gur. And he also contacted Mookie Betzer. Mookie Betzer, who would be who would eventually head Sayeret Matkal, was actually the acting head of Sayeret Matkal. For those of you who don't know, Sayeret Matkal is Israel's elite special forces unit, and although a person who obviously we'll speak about very soon, Yoni Netanyahu, who actually was head, Yoni Netanyahu was actually down near Sharm el-Sheikh, was involved in some sort of secret planning going in the Sinai, and therefore was other people as well, Dan Shomron, but Shimon Peres contacted all the chief, especially Matagur and others, to tell them to begin to formulate some sort of military operation, not with even the knowledge or the support of Yitzhak Rabin. Now, the Israel, and we'll soon see, once the demands are issued, so Israel is faced with this idea that they have to release it, and as Shimon Peres thought very, very strongly, he felt that we would be viewed, if they would be giving in to these demands, Israel would be viewed be humiliated as a coward of giving into demands, and therefore he was very strongly against that. And Rabin, on the other hand, felt that such a plan would be impossible to be able to put forth. Nevertheless, like I mentioned, he put forth. Now, Israel there's a lot behind the scenes here which I think has to figure into this. Number one is the idea, the thrill. I've often wondered to myself, because I spoke about this a few weeks ago on the 50th anniversary of the tragedy of Ma'alot, that how can it be that Israel was able to go to a foreign country in the middle of the night and successfully rescue, not 100% success, but pretty successfully rescue 105 hostages in a land that they never knew, flying in the middle of the night on a runway with not even knowing who would be there, yet in a building in broad daylight in the middle of Ma'alot, in the middle of the country of Israel, where at least 20 kids jumped out of the building and they had exact numbers, which hostages were who, what, and where. How come they couldn't have a successful? Now, obviously, the real reason is HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the one who decides what's successful, what's not successful. And we can do all the hishtadlus we want in this world. Obviously, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to be the determining factor. We realize that, what succeeds and what doesn't. But I think there's another factor that's important to mention, and that's I'm going to give it my own name, but that's the thrill factor, or the challenge factor. Meaning, I know here, even in the shul, if I ask someone, maybe want to walk around with the pushkas during Chazar Sashatz and to go around that the shul should raise money, so that's not an exciting thing. On the other hand, if I would ask, not everybody obviously, but if I would ask someone, I don't know anyone realizes how you change the bulbs in the main shul. I don't think most people even know. I can just tell you it's not a ladder, nor is there any sort of, like here, there's some sort of poles with some sort of grip on them that you lift to the ceiling. It's neither. One day we'll tell you how we can do it. But people who do know, there's a thrill involved in, you actually have to go outside the building, drop yourself into a crawl space about 4 feet high between the top of the roof of the 40 feet up of the main shul, sitting on planks. You actually have to remove the bulbs from under, meaning under them, and lift them out and replace them. But there's some sort of thrill involved. And honestly, the thrill of, I think, or the challenge of actually sending a military operation all the way a couple of thousand miles to Entebbe, Uganda, was there. But there were other things as well, which I think are important to realize why this was in place. And that is the following. Number one, again, this woman, I think her name was Patricia Murphy, I think that was her name, that was the first woman who got off. She had supplied, but she was never in Uganda. But already on, even though the demands were given on Tuesday the 29th, by Wednesday the 30th, 47 hostages are released. Now remember, they have about 250 or so hostages, 260, whatever, hostages. So about 47 hostages are released at that point. Part of it is that they didn't know how long it will be. They didn't need these. Most of them were old or sickly people. The Arabs didn't need them. They didn't want people dying. At that point, they were scared of people dying. So number one, already on Wednesday, they obviously had information about what was going on. But number two, and this is more critical, from 1971 into 1972, Israel actually trained Ugandan soldiers and paratroopers. In fact, Idi Amin went to Uganda went to Israel. Idi Amin went to Israel in 1971, where he always wore proudly Israeli paratrooper wings, even though he never really took the course, he just wore the wings. But that was par for his course. But he actually made a state visit to Israel, I think more than once, and actually Muki Betzer, who would be involved in the raid on Entebbe, actually lived in Uganda for 4 months, training. He was at that building for many, many times. He was at the old terminal. He trained Ugandan soldiers. He lived there he knew Entebbe, he knew the city, knew Kampala, he knew, so there were, it wasn't that, right from the start, it wasn't such and he had met Idi Amin many times. It wasn't something which was just out of nowhere. Also, that's one point. Also, there was a man named Berker Bar-Lev. Berker Bar-Lev, who at that point was a retired Israeli general, he actually was head of this, for 6 months or so, head of this Israeli mission in Uganda, where they were training the paratroopers. And he actually, he was very friendly with Idi Amin. He called him a number of times, beginning on Wednesday, June 30th. He called him a number of times, and he was able to get from him information from Idi Amin directly where the hostages were. He also was able to ascertain from Idi Amin, which was very important, Israel was unsure what Idi Amin's role in this was. Meaning, obviously if he allowed the plane to land, and obviously he had made all Israelis leave Uganda in 1972, and he certainly had aligned himself with Gaddafi, and he certainly aligned himself because Gaddafi, he broke off relations with Israel because they refused to send him Phantom jets, while Gaddafi did send him MiGs, Soviet-built MiGs, and therefore he liked Gaddafi more. But he actually was very friendly with this guy, Berker Bar-Lev, and when Bar-Lev called him a number of times, he was very friendly with him. And they were able to ascertain that Amin was very involved, that not only was allowing the hostages, but that the building was also surrounded by Ugandan troops. And that was very critical in Israeli planning. Initially, and we'll move to this, is that when there were a number of, obviously, obstacles which had to be overcome. The major obstacle that had to come was the following. How are we getting to Uganda? How are we getting to Uganda? How are we getting 2,000 miles, whatever it was, 3,000 miles to get to Uganda? So Israel actually had, and they still use them, and it's still, from what people tell, I don't know, but I once was in one actually, from courtesy of Bruce Public when he was chaplain at West Point. But the C-130 transport plane is actually a large plane and a very solid plane, and it can travel very far distances. So Israel had 4 or 5 C-130s, which were actually capable of flying to Uganda. The only problem was that there was not enough fuel in the airplane to carry it both to Uganda and back to Tel Aviv. Initially, the thought was that perhaps Idi Amin is a not-so-compliant person involved in this terrorist operation, and that if they could land in Uganda with the C-130s, take out the terrorists, so then Idi Amin would be the hero of the day, and he would allow the Israelis to refuel because he would celebrate with them. He kept claiming that anyway he wanted to help free the hostages, and then they would just maybe pay him for the fuel, but they would fly back. However, once the 47 hostages are released by Wednesday, and once these conversations take place, Bar-Lev is talking to Amin a number of times, it's clear right now, that Amin is not just a bystander, but he's protecting, and this was found out because out of the 4 hostages that were there on the plane, they were met with at least 3 more hostages who flew into Uganda, and the building, the old terminal, was surrounded by Ugandan troops. Now here we get to, again, some of the myths which we can talk about, which are true or not true, but again, I wasn't there, so I can only record what I saw. But if you remember, when I was reading the original story, it said that the facts are basically known, and what it said that the facts was they had released all non-Israeli and non-Jewish passengers, save for the flight crew, and few others who decided to remain with the Jewish hospital in Entebbe airport. Now, according to Ilan Hartuv, who we'll talk about now, according to Ilan Hartuv, this is not true. Ilan Hartuv passed away in 2017, 2018, but in interviews that he gave numerous times, and again, I haven't seen anybody refute this. And frankly, if you think about it, it seems to be very compelling, to be honest with you. Is that very compelling? Is that that's a myth, that they separated the Jews from the non-Jews, and that the only people they released all, as the article said, they released all, exact wording was, they released all non-Israeli and non-Jewish passengers. First of all, that sounds like that if it's non-Israeli and non-Jewish, so again, if it's who exactly, I don't know, but anyway, meaning they were Jewish who were non-Israeli. I don't know. But he claims that's definitely not true, and frankly, the facts don't seem to bear that out. There were many Jews, most of the plane were Jews. Like any other plane leaving from Israel, most of the people on the plane were Jews. And a lot of them were heading to other places. So he claims very clearly, Ilan Hartuv, who is one of the hostages, so he says very clear that there was no selection applied to Jews. Entebbe was not Auschwitz, said Hartuv in an interview. As he said, when he was 73 years old, when he was 83, he would die after. But what both Saul David records in his book on Entebbe and Ilan Hartuv also write in the very clearly is that most of the people released were Jews. Most of the people, in fact, in the book of Saul David, he points out there were 2 Lubavitcher Bachrim who had finished the year in learning, who were returning. They were Brazilian, and he gives their names, and plus other names he gives of people who were released. It's clear there were Jews released. Rather, more accurately, that's number one. There were clearly Jews who were released. I mean, we have names, we have this. That's not true. That what they did is the following. On Tuesday already, it was very crowded in this old terminal. The old terminal was very, very crowded. So they broke through a wall which connected to a smaller room. When they broke through the room which connected to the smaller room, in this smaller room they put about 83 people in the smaller room, and therefore there were approximately 140 as opposed to 250, or 150 as opposed to 240, whatever. It's crammed together in a large room. Those were certainly people of Israelis, that's for sure, Israelis. Honestly, I don't I don't know if there were any there may have been some even non-Jews, but they were Israeli. If you had Israeli papers with you, and if you had other foreign passports, you stayed in that main room. The only reason that this idea was that people said that the Israelis, that the Jews were separated, and they told this to the Nazi, this guy Boza, who was the Nazi guard, you're a Nazi, you're separating, and someone showed him his number, that may be true. And Boza responded very, very hurtfully, no, I'm against Zionists, I'm not against Jews. Truth be told, that there's the only reason for that is that there were about 8 Orthodox Jews. There were about 8 Orthodox Jews who, for whatever the reason, I guess we know the reason, that they stayed with the Israelis. Maybe they had connection with them, whatever the reason was, but they stayed with the Israelis, and they were also, being that they were wearing yarmulkes, and being when the Ugandans brought them the tray food, they refused to eat. So that's true that the terrorists stuck those Jews, those from Jew. If you were an Orthodox Jew, if anything, we could have used this, in our camp of what it means to be an Orthodox Jew, and maybe, Orthodox Jews have our own issues. But if you were a secular American Jew, you were freed. In fact, there would be 2 hostage releases. There would be one, 47 would be released on Wednesday, and then another 100 were released. Another 100 or so were released, even more, were released on Thursday. Again, Idi Amin claimed this was all to his good negotiating skills. Again, they were all non-Israelis, but they were not all non-Jews. That's total. Not only that, most of them were Jewish. Most of those people released were Jewish. In fact, there were from Jews released too, some of them. Like I said, these 2 Lubavitcher Bochum, that this Hartuv actually went to bat for them. They're 2 17-year-old Bochum, let them go. But on the other hand, it is true that 8 Orthodox Jews were forced to be in the Israeli group. And according to Saul David's accounting, a couple who were an American couple, just because they were from, they actually refused, but nevertheless, I guess they considered them Zionists enough for, I don't know if they would have been in the Trey Carter, where they would have been in the thing, but whatever it was, the reality was that there were about 8 Orthodox Jews placed with the Israeli group, but other than that, Jews were released, and not just non-Jews. So that's seemingly, to me anyway, that's as Hartuv said, that seems to be true. And number two is that there's another myth which is very famous, which is well known. Like I said in the article, we said the facts are well known. The facts are known to all, basic facts, and save for the flight crew and few others who decided to remain with the Jewish hostages, that's also a non-truth. That's also a myth. Truth be told, the crew would have left. How do we know the crew very probably would have left? Well, number one is when it was very painful when they separated the Israelis and those 8 from Jews, and they put them in the smaller room. That's when there was this feeling of division, and obviously you can understand, especially we're only talking about 30 years after Auschwitz and the Selektia, and there were Holocaust survivors there. It's almost 50 years ago. There were a lot more. The memory of Auschwitz was quite clear, and there was some sort of Selektia, some sort of selection. So obviously, that, and people did say that even when they got out, and certainly, to be honest with you, I can't tell if someone did it intentionally or not, but it certainly played well in the press that the Jews are being separated, especially just 30 years after the Holocaust. But the crew, they were actually asked by the Israelis if they would join them in the Israeli room. They were asked, would you join us, please, in the Israeli room? And the crew said, no. They asked to think about it, and they said no, because if anybody's going to get killed, it's going to be you guys first, and we also have families, and we're not going into that room. Now, as far as staying, they were never given a choice. Meaning, would they eventually trade? Maybe they would have. I can't speak for them. But it's a total fallacy. Even though you can find on the internet, the pilot, by the way, Michal, whatever his name was, Colin, I don't have it now. He lived for a very long time. He just died not so long ago. He lived way into his 90s. There's a park named after him, and he got medals, and Israel this. But truth be told, we don't really have any anecdotal information of him being such a hero on the plane. In fact, frankly, when that famous Shabbos, when the Shabbos, when they would be freed on that last Shabbos they would spend there, he actually was a person who told them, stop singing Zmiros. It's gonna go ahead and it's gonna cause problems. So I'm just saying that there wasn't, again, and plus, by the way, Israel, by the way, 67 of the hostages would eventually bring a class action suit against Air France for this, and they were settled out of court for a few $1 million. And part of the deposition involved that the crew itself were not the nicest always to the Jewish hostages. The simple reason seems to be that they were never given a choice, for the simple reason that all along the hostages felt, that the terrorists felt, that the way that they were going to get them out was to fly the plane out. And they had no one else to fly the plane out. I mean, the terrorists were under the assumption that Israel would negotiate, Israel would have no way to get to Uganda, and that a plane would come with whatever the plane would come, with the free terrorists, and then the Air France plane would be needed to fly now the freed hostages back to France. So they were never given a choice, which seems to honestly be compelling to me. And honestly also, not just Hartov and others say that, again, but to be very honest, it was certainly more exciting, and certainly we need heroes, we want heroes, Jewish people want heroes. It was good for France, it was good for Israel, it was good for the Jews to say that these people stayed, and they certainly were released with them, so it played well. Again, I don't know what I would have done either, but I'm just saying that notwithstanding this article that the basic facts are known, the basic fact seems to be the basic untruth. Doesn't seem to be that the Jews were separated, nor does it seem to be that the crew opted on their own to stay. Be that as it may, by Thursday, July 1st, that was supposed to be the deadline that they would begin killing the hostages. And at that point, Yitzhak Rabin officially said, he announced that Israel was going to negotiate, and the headline in the New York Post that day read, Israel surrenders to terrorists. Because again, Israel had developed this myth, notwithstanding that in 1968 they didn't negotiate, but Israel had successfully developed this myth that they don't negotiate, and therefore that was big news. But Israel asked for one thing. They asked if they can extend the deadline, because since we were talking about all types of hostages from different countries, and it would take a while to get all of them together and to get these other countries to agree, so therefore they needed extra days. Now there was another problem as well. Because if you remember, I mentioned to you that five of the hostages were supposedly had to be released from Kenya. Kenya, which borders Uganda, had terrible relations. The head of Kenya hated Idi Amin, and he didn't like Kenya. They had very tenuous, they went through a lot of, in fact, it would be eventually Kenya which would help in 1978 overthrow Idi Amin. In early 1976, in January of 1976, the Mossad found out a plan that there were 3 Arab terrorists, aided by 2 Germans, who were planning with handheld rocket launchers were going to shoot down an El Al plane as it landed in Kenya airport. Is the Mossad, even though Kenya didn't have official diplomatic relations with Israel, it had good relations privately. And Israel told the Kenyan, CIA about this plot. And obviously Kenya wouldn't look good for Kenya to have any aircraft blown up over its sky. So Kenya arrested the 3 Arabs before they had a chance to shoot down the plane. And when the German terrorists arrived, who were supposed to arrive to free them, they were arrested as well. But Kenya certainly didn't need Arabs in their jail, or even Germans in their jail. And Israel certainly wanted them. So Kenya had already secretly spirited these 5 terrorists to Israel, and they remained in Israel. They were sentenced to, could be, I don't know if they were ever released. The Germans were eventually released. But the 3 Arabs, I don't know if they eventually released, but part of the problem was the Kenyan, no one knew, and Kenya couldn't admit that the 5 hostages, the 5 terrorists that Kenya wanted released, that the terrorists wanted released from Kenya weren't even in Kenya anymore. So now the plan, and Idi Amin also was due over the weekend to fly to preside over the Union of African Unity, which he was the president of. So at this point, and Peres was working very hard to run this military plan. So therefore, this is what we, beginning after the night of Thursday, July 1st, when Israel announced it was willing to negotiate, and they extended the deadline to noon on July 4th, A, because Israel had agreed to negotiate, B, Idi Amin anyway wanted to be there for pictures when they would be freed, and he had this previous engagement to preside over the African Conference of Unity. So therefore, that gave Israel a lot of time, and they were able to pull this together for a number of reasons. Number one, as I mentioned to you, nobody but Mookie Betzer himself had lived in Uganda. He lived in Uganda for 4 or 5 months. He knew very well the plan. He knew also, to be very honest, that Uganda soldiers, suffice to say, were not the most motivated in the world. And he was able to assure them that he doubted that the fact that Uganda was involved, that these soldiers would fight back, was unlikely. That was number one. But 2, he knew somewhat the lay of the land. He was in the airport. That was number 1. Number 2, by Thursday night, July 1st, over 147 passengers had been released. And over the 100 that were released, there was even some ex-French military personnel. Some Jewish, Saul David doesn't exactly say who was Jewish, who was not. You can infer sometimes. But these people knew very well. They knew exactly, some of them knew when they were going to be released. Some of them even smuggled photographs they even knew the names of the terrorists at that point. And they gave them precise information, and the Mossad was very good at interrogating. How many doors are there? The doors open in, or doors open out? How big is the building? How large is the building? Where did the terrorists hang out during the day? Where did they hang out during the night? What are they armed with? Are they armed with small arms or larger arms? Now, all this, Israel was able to gather a huge amount of information as to exactly what the building looked like, as to where the hostages were being held, as to what the terrorists were armed with. Plus, when the Israelis were placed in their small room, there were these cardboard boxes placed in the room with Amin and the terrorists claimed were booby-trapped, and if anybody touched them, they would blow up. However, by Thursday the 1st, remember they were moved into that on Tuesday, by Thursday enough kids had knocked into them, enough people had used them to hang their dirty shirts that they couldn't wash, that basically everybody knew that there was no bombs in them. And people accidentally knocking into them realized they were empty boxes. So therefore, even that they were able to convey that it didn't look at all like the place was booby-trapped whatsoever. Another point of information Israel found out that Solel Boneh, the largest, at least it was, I don't know if it still is, the largest construction company in Israel, had actually built the Entebbe terminal in the late 60s, 70s. They actually had built this terminal. They built it. I mean, that was always the way the terminal was, but this old terminal, when it was the new terminal, before in the mid-70s when they built even a newer terminal, that old terminal was built by Sol Boneh. Israel had the exact blueprints of what the terminal looked like. Added to this was the fact that Kenya, again, which was very happy if Israel would have assassinated Idi Amin while they were there, more than happy. Certainly no love lost between those two countries. Kenya, a pilot, took off from Kenya Airport, which was not far from Entebbe Airport, in a small plane, and he took aerial photographs, very precise aerial photographs, while the hostages were there over Wednesday. Over Wednesday and Thursday, he made a number of trips, paid for, of course, by the Mossad, and even he contacted Entebbe International Airport. He said, I'm in danger, I'm having flight problems, I'm circling, I think I have to land, I'm coming down for a landing. Of course, he never came down for the landing. Oh, I just got control of the plane again. While doing this, he was snapping hundreds and hundreds of pictures with precise location as to where what the old terminal was, where the planes were, what was there, what exactly was there, how many soldiers were there, how many Uganda soldiers. So truthfully, from the time the plane lands in Uganda on Monday until we get to Friday, July 2nd, Israel has a lot of information. But besides Siyata Deshmaya, which obviously is number one, but the greatest thing Israel has, and the greatest thing to this day to have, is surprise. There's no greater weapon than the unexpected. The unexpected to this day remains the greatest weapon. In fact, to be very honest with you, that's the weapon really behind terror. The reason we call it terrors or terrorists is that the whole goal of terrorists is that Rabbi Eisenman gets phone calls, which he got 2 this week, of people who have tickets to Israel, should they go or not, because that's what terrorists want to do. They want to put terror and the unexpected in people's lives. Is it safe to go to Israel? Is it not safe to go? Needless to say, with Hashem's help, I have a ticket for tomorrow, 1:30's flight, so I certainly said I don't think it's dangerous, so I think you can go too, but again, everyone can judge on their own. But Israel had the exact opposite. Israel didn't have terror, but Israel had the surprise. I mean, the unexpected. The last thing in the world, in fact, one of the reasons that the PFLP chose not even to stay in Libya, which would be closer to Israel, but to go to Uganda, but they couldn't imagine a place. Plus, to get to Uganda, Israel would be forced to fly over Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Sudan airspace. They couldn't imagine that Israel would do such a thing. Plus, as I mentioned, the planes had to be refueled. So we now move to a number of unsung heroes who, frankly, who should be mentioned. So Israel realized, and there, by the way, I'm just going to quickly, I'm not going to get into that, there were plans to drop paratroopers into Lake Victoria, but when they realized Lake Victoria was full of man-eating crocodiles, they quickly abandoned that plan. And there were other plans, I said, to have a fake plane, Air France plane, come in to say that this was a medical plane and just kill the terrorists. But again, that once they realized that the Ugandan soldiers were in on this, they realized that they would have to land a force that could really deal with the Ugandan soldiers. And initially, some wanted to actually land a force of about 1,000 people. Ultimately, Yoni Netanyahu, Mookie Betzer, and others actually convinced that a force of just 100 soldiers, with a force of just 100 soldiers, based on, again, to be honest with you, I would say the lack of capabilities that they gave to the Ugandan soldiers, the element of surprise that the terrorists would certainly feel, that, or they never would expect them, the ability to have these photographs of exactly where they were, the information gleaned from the hostages who were released, the blueprints of the building from Solo Bona. Included in that, I still think, is the challenge, that drive, that adrenaline that as a people and a country gets to be able to be on such a mission, ultimately resulted in Shimon Peres being able to convince Mota Gur and finally Yitzhak Rabin that on Friday that the plan could be held. Why? So enter one of the Chasidei Umas HaOlam, Bruce Roy Mackenzie. Bruce Roy Mackenzie was born in South Africa on the 1st of January 1919. He dies on May 24th, 1978, at the age of 59. Now, as most of us know, all of Africa, not all, but most part of Africa was really colonized by white settlers, a lot of them British. Kenya used to be a British part of the British Commonwealth. Uganda was part of the British Commonwealth. We're familiar, South Africa was its own sort of country, whatever it was. For a while it was also part of the British Commonwealth. It had its own country, apartheid and all that. So Mackenzie was a white man who had lived after South Africa in Kenya, and he was actually very friends with the president of Jomo Kenyatta, very friendly with Kenyatta. And Kenyatta liked him very much and he was a very capable man. And Kenyatta liked him for one reason. He was white, and as a white man, he knew he could never take over his position. Because already Kenya at that point had independence. They certainly weren't going to have a white man running a black country in Africa. So he was a safe man. He was also a man who dabbled in intelligence. It's alleged that he was the man in 1976 who got the 2 German and 3 Arab suspected wanted by Israel for an attempted missile attack. He was the one involved in secretly transporting them to Israel. He was a member of the Legislative Council in Kenya. He was also had contacts with a lot of the, I think it's called the M16, that's the British. Some say he was a Mossad agent, some say he was a British M16 agent, but he certainly dabbled in espionage, and he loved Israel. He was a lover of Jews and a lover of Israel. And he was the one who persuaded President Kenyatta to allow the Mossad to, some say he was the one who allowed them to have that plane take off, and he was the one who convinced them, some say he was even in that plane that took the aerial photographs, but he was the one who convinced Kenyatta to allow the planes to refuel in Kenya. Now, why would Kenyatta agree to allow the planes to refuel in Kenya when Kenya didn't have relations with Israel, was also part of the African Unity Group, and was also officially an anti-Israel country? So once again, lo me'avas Mordechai, ele mesinas Haman. It's not necessarily Kenyatta was such a lover of Jews, but he certainly was a hater of Haman, and the Haman in our story, of course, is Idi Amin. He hated Idi Amin. Idi Amin had killed Kenyans. Idi Amin had smuggled arms through Kenya and he certainly didn't like him. Plus, Ehud Barak, who would eventually become the Prime Minister of Israel, There are those who, again, these things maybe they'll never be known. They brought a nice briefcase with cash. Plus, believe it or not, at that point there was still a lot of even Jewish interest in Kenya. There was a family called the Block family, who actually was one of the wealthy hotel owners, entrepreneurs, the Hilton family in America, that owned hotels in Kenya. There are those who say that they also had a hand in sweetening the pot, and that he agreed. And if he agreed, he said that, by the way, I'm not part of this whole thing, but the person who really was involved in the operation was Mackenzie, Bruce Mackenzie. He was the one who convinced Kenyatta to do this, and if anybody would ever say, they say they landed for humanitarian reasons. By the way, as a postscript, on May 24th, 1978, Mackenzie was killed when a bomb attached to his aircraft as he departed, believe it or not, he went back to Uganda because he had business dealings. After departing a meeting with Idi Amin, he was killed when his plane blew up. Some say that most people assume Idi Amin knew about Mackenzie's involvement with the Entebbe, and this was his payback. How did he kill him? There are those who say he gave him a gift when he left of either a mounted antelope head or a carved wooden statue of a lion's head. Hidden in there was a bomb, and whatever the reason is, he was killed in 1978, and Israel's head of the Mossad in one of the JNF forests is the Bruce Mackenzie Memorial Forest, in recognition of the help he gave Israel during that time. But Israel gave to Kenya a number of things which was very important. Number one, Israel, first of all, agreed by doing this military operation, Kenya avoided having to admit, which they never would want to admit to Idi Amin, that the 5 hostages that were needed from Kenya to be released were in Israel. So they certainly didn't want to. So they had added interest, besides perhaps financial interest, but they had added interest to have, no one would ever have to know about that. That was very good. Number two, and more importantly, and this is another, again, I have to have some chidush, this is another point to debunk, is that most stories tell us that when the Israelis, like I said, no spoiler alert, because most of you know the story, at least for a good point, is that the Israelis destroyed about 12 MiG planes that were sitting at Entebbe Airport. Most reports tell us that this was to prevent Idi Amin from sending the planes to chase the C-130s and to shoot them out of the sky. Could be true. I have no way of proving either way. But again, because Kenya risked a lot, and by the way, there were Kenyans killed in retribution. Idi Amin killed about 300 Kenyans who were working in Uganda at the time. But another reason which I find compelling is that Idi Amin wanted that eventually Kenya would be involved with Tanzania of overthrowing Idi Amin. And on whatever they could do to destroy his air force was certainly to their benefit. There are those who claim, Saul David claims this as well, others dispute, maybe it's both, I can't tell you. Again, the reason I doubt the idea that Idi Amin would send his MiGs afterward, again, from what we'll see later on, Idi Amin, if he was one thing, and that he was a big coward, and that he was and frankly, he had barely control over his own military. It doesn't seem too likely that that happened. But either that, whatever the reason was, another reason why Kenya agreed to this deal was because Kenya would be paid back that Idi Amin's air force would be basically decimated. So finally, on Friday, after Thursday night, basically there was a late Thursday night, Friday morning, the plan was finalized. And after different suggestions, this was the plan. The plan would be there would be 4 C-130s who would take off 10 minutes apart from Sharm el-Sheikh. And the plan was to arrive on, by the way, that point in between 1974 and I think 1976, Israel didn't have daylight savings time. I had to figure this out research-wise when I was doing my book, how I was reading the book, because as we'll soon see, they wanted to arrive at midnight Entebbe time, and it was Friday night. It was what do you call it? At that point, it was Motzei Shabbos already. It was Saturday night at midnight. But if you look in the Israeli records, you see that it was 11 p.m. So I had and I know if you look up nowadays time, Uganda and Tel Aviv, they're on the same time. That's because in that time period, Israel was not yet on daylight savings time, so Israel was an hour off. Israel was still an hour behind. So they wanted to land at midnight in Entebbe time, and therefore they had to take off at about a 7-hour trip. So they had to take off at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Shabbos, and they presented the plan. They presented the plan on Thursday night to Rabin. Rabin said Friday we're going to meet, the cabinet will meet and approve the plan. And this was the plan they presented, that 4 C-130s would take off from Sharm el-Sheikh at approximately between 3:30 and 4 on Shabbos afternoon, July 3rd. They would land in Entebbe at midnight. It would already be Sunday, July 4th. The first plane would carry a crew, would just carry maybe more people too, but basically the 30 assault team, there would just be an assault team of 30 people with a black Mercedes. Again, I found no evidence supporting this claim that anything to do with, that Amin drove anything except a black Mercedes. This claim in this article that it said later on that one of the quote-unquote basic facts is that Ugandan soldier apparently saw that Mercedes was black, not the white model that Amin began using. There's no evidence to that as well. This, I think, also, I've done no other supporting except for this one article. But they actually got a Mercedes. They fixed it up. They put on a Ugandan license plate. They put on Ugandan flag. That would fly out. They would head immediately from they would land at the airport. They were able, even though eventually when they did land, the airport lights were on, but they had figured out a way through radar to be able to land silently even if the airport lights were off. This would be followed by 3 more 130s. The number 1, number 2, and number 3 would be backup. 2 being backup to take care of Ugandan soldiers if they fight back. 3 being to take out the MiGs. And C-134 would be basically an empty plane which would be to take the hostages back to Israel. Rabin informed all the ministers, including the frum ones, that they should stay in town for Shabbos. Everybody should stay in town near Tel Aviv, because we have to meet Saturday morning, Shabbos morning, July 3rd. There's an important meeting of the cabinet. There is some plan on the table, and therefore Zvulun Hammer, Zarek Wahaftig, there were Yosef Burg, there were Orthodox members of the cabinet. They all stayed in Shabbos. They wouldn't have to be Michal Shabbos to drive from Jerusalem, and they would stayed, and indeed at 11 o'clock, noon or so, Shabbos morning, the Rabin finally, with Mata Gur's insistence, and Shimon Peres's also insistence, they presented the plan. The first plane would be a 707, which would take off and would land in Kenya. Ehud Barak would be on that plane, and that would be the plane that would set up a mobile hospital in Kenya. It would land first and set up a mobile hospital in Kenya, which would be the operating system would set up there and would plan that when they would fly back to Kenya for refueling, whatever hostage, the assumption there would be some casualties, they would be treated there. There were total 5 planes involved. A second 707 took off. That was the command plane. That's where Dan Shomron was. That circled over Entebbe Airport the whole time. Circled over Entebbe Airport. That was the control center that the troops on the ground communicated with the 707 in the air, and it was the 707 in the air that communicated with Tel Aviv, communicated with Rabin and Peres and the army staff in Tel Aviv, in the Kiryat, in the bunker, and to this day, which is the defense headquarters in Tel Aviv. The other 3 planes involved were C-130, 4 3-130s, 6 total planes total. The first C-130 would be with the attack force of 20, supposed to be 30, I think at the end there were 27. The commander was Yoni Netanyahu. The second in command was Muki Betzer. Giora Fleischman was third in command. And the plan was as such. Idi Amin, again, this was all known because they had a lot of information that anytime Idi Amin came to them, he came in a black Mercedes, followed by 2 Land Rovers. The 2 Land Rovers are, I guess, some sort of open, I don't know what exactly they look like, but more military type vehicles. And they would be containing Israeli soldiers. To this day, I have yet to ascertain with accuracy, although I've heard reports both ways, that with Netanyahu and his others, did they wear blackface or they did not wear blackface? They certainly wore Ugandan army uniforms. Obviously, it would be politically incorrect if they wore blackface nowadays. So I don't know if they did or they didn't. But I've seen reports that said yes, some said no. But they were in the, it would make sense they did, frankly, because part of the whole thing was the element of surprise. And they had to drive about 100 yards. They knew the runway was by the new airport. They could not take the plane to where the old terminal was. It was just blocked off the way the runways were. They would have to drive there via. So the plan was that the 27 troops would be divided approximately, the first 8 or 9 would be in the Mercedes, which was the camouflage. The surprise would be, because they knew there were Ugandan troops on the airport, they knew that. But to get to the old terminal, the assumption was they would assume Idi Amin is coming for another run of his visits. He had come almost every day, and he had arrived that night, by the way, on Friday night. On Friday night, when he came back from that African conference, he went right to the airport to meet with them. So for sure, it certainly was not unusual that Idi Amin made these visits. I mean, he was enjoying the publicity anyway. Behind them were 2 Land Rovers, which was also how Idi Amin traveled. Altogether, they pushed into these 3 vehicles 27 people, 27 Sayeret Matkal, and they would pass the Ugandan guards. The plan was that they would park in front of the old terminal. They would quickly exit the vehicle. Yoni Netanyahu, as the commander of the unit, would station himself outside of the old terminal, and he would direct. There would be basically, they thought, or at least the plan was, there were 3 doors leading into the old terminal, and therefore there would be approximately 9 men, 8 or 9 men in each one of these 3 units that would burst in through the 3 doors. Again, they knew who the terrorists were. They knew what they looked like. One was a woman, one was a German man. Then they knew at least there were 3 other Arabs, to be total, I think there were 7 total Arabs. But they would burst in, and the whole thing was built on the element of surprise. The element of surprise that these terrorists, the last thing they could expect on 12 o'clock July 4th, on Independence Day in America, would be Israeli soldiers to be arriving in the old terminal unannounced. And behind them would be the Land Rovers that would, if necessary, had heavier guns, and they would be the backup just for the assault. 10 minutes later, the second plane would land, which would just cover the airport, which would just cover the airport if necessary, eliminate any fighting, because they knew that there were Ugandan soldiers just not even far from there. And 10 minutes after that, the third plane, which had nothing to do with the assault, the third plane landed, which would just destroy the 12 MiGs, which were stationed at the Uganda airport. The first plane landed exactly at 12:01, which was 11:01 Israeli time, Friday night, Motzei Shabbos, 12:01 Sunday morning, Uganda time, and it indeed headed with the black Mercedes at 40 miles an hour for approximately a 3-minute drive to the old terminal. And again, the plan was that they would quickly fan out, enter for the 3 entrances to the terminal, eliminate, or they say nowadays, neutralize all the terrorists, and quickly huddle and then wait there until planes 2, 3, and 4 landed. At that point, they would settle the hostages, make sure they had eliminated all the terrorists. If needed, the airport would be secure by the approximately another 30 soldiers in plane 2, and plane 3 would land, which didn't necessarily could do their work even later. Plane 3 would work, because that was just eliminating the MiGs. They would just move to that part of the airport where the MiGs were, and by the time the airport, once they heard from plane 2 that the airport was secure, the soldiers in the Sayeret Matkal would take the hostages out and load them onto plane 4, which had just landed, and would quickly take off, never shutting off its engines. Everything went miraculously well, notwithstanding, I guess, there some things should have, maybe didn't. When the first plane landed, the airport lights were on, and nobody said a thing. The back of the plane opened up as a C-130 does. The hatch opens up from the back. The Mercedes drove off with the Ugandan flags, and they were on their way to the airport, very, very on their way to go ahead and to the old terminal. Here's where things get sticky, what happened at this point. Again, one thing is for sure, this story, that that a Ugandan soldier apparently saw the Mercedes was black, not the white model that Amin began using. A firefight broke out, and result, Yoni Netanyahu commanded the mission, was fatally wounded. That nobody says. I think that totally we can dismiss. What's been going on since that day on July 4th, 1976, again, not so much for us in this room, but those who follow Israeli politics, it's still alive and well 48 years later, because Mookie Betzer is alive and well 48 years later, is what happened at that point. What happens is, and the facts that everybody agrees upon is the following. The facts that agreed upon is that the Mercedes, the black Mercedes with Yoni Netanyahu, Mookie Betzer, Giora Fleischman, and the best troops, and with the Land Rover, everything was going merrily along until an Ugandan soldier approached, cocked his rifle, and said, and held his rifle. Now, what happened after that, that's all we know. Everybody agrees. Everybody agrees when a Ugandan soldier approached and cocked his rifle. That's agreed upon. It's also agreed upon that Yoni Netanyahu ordered the car, the Mercedes, to cut right, meaning towards the soldier, because he was just on the side. And it's also not disputed that Yoni Netanyahu took out his own pistol with a silencer and ordered Giora Fleischman, who also had a silencer on his, and to kill this Ugandan soldier. That fact is also not disputed. It's also not disputed that Mookie Betzer told Yoni Netanyahu, don't fire, there's no danger. There's also no dispute that they did not kill him. There's no dispute that the Ugandan soldier fell. Either he tripped over his own feet out of fear, either he was lightly wounded, but no one argues the fact that they saw out of the window that he was getting up on his feet. There's also no dispute that therefore the Land Rover, one of the Land Rovers who were equipped with machine guns, loud machine guns, at that point, once they saw the Uganda soldier shot at and rise to his feet with his gun, there's no doubt that they began firing to eliminate him. There's also no doubt that at that point, in hearing the gunshots, which were not silenced, Ugandan soldiers began to fire from the new guard tower, which oversaw the whole perimeter of this place, and there was wild shooting going on, and luckily the Land Rover put it, and soon afterward, Plane 2 landed, and they were instructed to engage very strongly with the Ugandan soldiers in the air control tower. And there's also no disputing that at that point they abandoned, although they were further from the terminal than they wanted to be, they abandoned the vehicles and they proceeded by foot to assault and the terminal. And honestly, at this point, there's also sort of no dispute that for the most part, they successfully surprised the Arabs, and they were able, which we'll get to in a minute, to more or less successfully achieve. However, the disputed facts are this Ugandan soldier and what this has to do with Yoni Netanyahu. And basically, for the last 48 years, you have the Betzer, and it's been turned into, unfortunately, a political football, especially after Yoni's younger brother, the middle of the three boys, Yoni, the older, of course, is Yoni, baby is number 2, Ido is number 3. Ido has written a book, Ido Netanyahu, the third brother, has written a book, Yoni's Last Battle. There's another book called Declassified, which is the official version of Sayeret Matkal, even though it was just quote-unquote declassified maybe 10 years ago. And then there's Mookie Betzer's book, Secret Soldier, and each one has its own narrative as to what happened. Unfortunately, one thing is clear, that Yoni Netanyahu is dead. And one thing is clear, that Yoni Netanyahu was killed at Entebbe. And one thing is clear, that we'll never know Yoni Netanyahu's narrative or his side of the story, because he never got to say it. But nevertheless, and Betzer claims that basically, although he loved Yoni Netanyahu and he was a great soldier, he claims that basically Yoni was responsible for his own death. And frankly, he's not an Orthodox man, so I don't want to say the grace of Hashem, but only out of luck was the rest of the mission successful. But he basically claims Yoni Netanyahu almost is not the hero of the story, he's almost the goat of the story. Betzer's account of what went on was that Betzer, and again this is based on that he lived in Uganda for 4 months, and he claims that this was standard procedure, that every time he came to his house in the 4 months that he lived in Uganda, which was protected by 2 Ugandan soldiers, that the normal procedure was that as his car approached, even though they saw him daily for 4 months do this, as the car would approach, the Ugandan soldier would raise to attention, and he would cock his gun, and would bring it as if he was, going to fire, raise it to some sort of position, and say the words "advance." And this was procedure. There was no danger about it. There was nothing to be frightened of. There was nothing to be scared of. There was nothing to be afraid of, anything whatsoever, that this was standard procedure, and therefore he instructed Yoni, don't shoot, don't shoot. There's a standard procedure. The fact that he's raising his weapon and that he's engaging his weapon is just standard procedure, and that's what he's claimed, and therefore he claims that that caused them to, first of all, it claimed that they lost a lot of they lost the element of surprise. He claims that that caused them to have to almost abort the mission, or at least begin the mission 30, 40 yards prior to where they were housed to. And he also claims that therefore a Ugandan soldier killed Yoni Netanyahu, and it was his own fault, because they had to abandon the vehicle much further away from the old terminal that it was, that therefore he was in the open, Yoni Netanyahu, and he shouldn't have been. He would have been closer to the old terminal, protected from he was shot from the tower, from the air control tower, because they had a clear view of him. Thankfully nobody else was killed, and it's really like a miracle that they were able to still more or less pull off the mission. Ido Netanyahu and the Netanyahu camp claim just the opposite, and there are other people from Sayeret Matkal in this book Declassified who were quoted as claiming the same. They claim that this wasn't the plan. The plan was that the soldier would just stand there but not cock his rifle, not engage the rifle, not bring it to a shooting position. And this was not part of the plan, and therefore Yoni was right in having him eliminated, and he certainly did pose a threat, and he would have shot, and that would have aborted the mission. In fact, they claim that Betzer certainly at one point when he went on foot to go to the terminal, Betzer stalled for a moment, that he admitted himself. He claims it was just for a second to reload. The Netanyahu family claims that he almost botched the mission and he caused Yoni to be killed, because Yoni had to go then into an open position to push everyone into battle position, because Betzer didn't do what he was supposed to do, which was storm the first door. He bypassed the door and stood there, and Yoni had to go out and scream. Again, part of this happens to, unfortunately, tie into the idea that and I don't want to touch on, but it is mentioned in all the books, and that is that because obviously nowadays, you don't need Chuck Schumer to say this. I'm sure you're all aware that Bibi Netanyahu is probably one of the most hated people in Israel, even before October 7th, but certainly after October 7th, he's certainly not one of the most, he certainly has his supporters, but he certainly has his detractors, and therefore there are those who believe that Bibi Netanyahu's success is completely on the coattails of his brother's reported heroism, and therefore only because he has his brother who died in the most famous anti-terrorist event in the history of the world, he achieved his success. And obviously the Netanyahu camp claims that you took a person who gave his life for Klal Yisrael and you made him into a blundering fool. Part of this machlokas, by the way, part of this dispute also involves, and again, I'm not sure exactly what difference does it make, but the Netanyahu family also maintains that he was killed by a terrorist, not by a Ugandan soldier. The Betzer camp maintains that he was killed by a Ugandan soldier. I imagine the difference is that being killed by a Ugandan soldier is more indicative of a state of doing something improper and allowing yourself to be killed by somebody from an incompetent soldier who never really wanted to engage you, as opposed to dying a hero's death of a terrorist shooting you. Again, I wasn't there, and frankly, like I said, there's a lot of ink to this day that is still discussed that. Whatever it is, there is important things to discuss quickly, though, but just about the battle itself. There's no doubt that there was an unbelievable siyata d'shmaya, because everybody agrees, be it the Betzer version, be it the Netanyahu version. Everybody agrees that all hell broke loose once that Ugandan soldier was fired upon. That wasn't the plan. That everybody agrees. Everybody agrees that the airport went wild with fire that fire was fired from all angles at that point, which was not the plan. And frankly, if the only, the books aren't written by God-believing people, but unless if you believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's really hard to understand why another Ma'alot didn't happen at that point. But for whatever the reason, the terrorists apparently were the element of surprise was so great, and their emunah shlema in the impossibility of IDF soldiers coming there, that notwithstanding they heard soldiers, they heard fire, they heard fire being exchanged, and they could see tracer bullets outside, they actually, according to some of the hostages, they heard the terrorists scream, "My God, the Ugandan soldiers have gone crazy, they're firing at us." Now, honestly, it's not as crazy as you think, because as you'll soon see, the Ugandan soldiers are, put it this way, they're certainly, I would not be happy if they were protecting us on Shabbos morning, the Ugandan soldiers. Let's just leave it as such. Either way, when they when they give to the terminal, apparently the terrorists are surprised. They're surprised enough that they're shocked, and the Israelis have the upper hand, even though they don't have the home field advantage, even though they're the ones coming into a room that they just came for the first time in their life. It's the terrorists who are shocked. And frankly, some of the terrorists never squeezed off one bullet. Both Germans, the German woman never squeezed off a bullet. But at that point, when the Israelis finally burst into the terminal, the terrorists are the ones standing, holding guns. They're easily identifiable. And literally, within 53 seconds, the battle is over. Within less than a minute, the entire battle is over. Again, it's not clear who killed what, and that's also a question, who gets credit for killing who. But basically, the terrorists, the Israelis, storm the building. The terrorists do shoot back. They certainly they do. But again, except for that version that one of them killed Yoni, they didn't succeed in shooting one Israeli soldier, even wounding one Israeli soldier, even though there definitely was some shooting back, and they had grenades. They don't succeed in shooting anyone. And they're eliminated very quickly by the Israeli Sayeret Matkal force, who quickly identified the terrorists as they're standing there, I guess in a state of shock. And the Israelis were marksmen. I'm sure they were better shooters than the terrorists as well. They trained very much for this, for single shot being exact, especially after Ma'alot. And they quickly eliminate the terrorists. Unfortunately, and the terrorists are the ones there, unfortunately, there are 3 Jews who were killed as well. 3 Jews who were killed as well. Most probably, all 3 Jews were killed by the Israeli soldiers, most probably. We know for sure that Jean-Jacques Mimano, who was a 19-year-old French Jew, was killed by the Israeli soldiers because they admitted it. Plus, they know when they shot him. He, again, also different versions, but according to one version, one of the terrorists was able to throw some sort of incendiary device, or incendiary. Why he had an incendiary device is not clear to me. Why would that be a lethal weapon against terrorists? It's a little strange. But according to one version, he threw some incendiary device which caught a brief fire by some of the, most of the, this was 12 o'clock at night. Everyone was sleeping already, or at least in bed, or under the covers. So a cover caught fire, and this young man, Jean-Jacques Mimouni, who was a Sephardic Jew from North African origin, who had dark skin, he jumped out of this blanket, according to one version, and he was shot dead. According to other versions, he certainly jumped up. He certainly jumped up, and he certainly started to run towards the back, that's for sure. Whether because his blanket caught fire, whether because he got scared, whatever the reason is, he was certainly killed by Israeli That's admitted by Israel. Pascal Cohen, who was an older man, was also killed by Israelis. Nobody argues with that. He was killed accidentally, but he was killed. Shooting bullets, people killed. Ida Baranovich, a Russian Jew. That there's a machlokes. Some say she was claimed by the Israelis. Some claim she was killed in the crossfire. It's likely she was killed by the Israelis as well. So three Jews are killed certainly during the battle. We mentioned Ilan Hartov. Ilan Hartov, who was the official Israeli, also like spokesperson in this whole thing, he actually, his mother, on Thursday evening, his mother was choking. His mother's name was Dora Bloch. Now, Bloch, he changed his name to Hartov because he worked for the Israeli government. Back then, if you worked for the Israeli government, you had to Hebraicize your name. If your name was David Green, it became Ben Gurion. If your name was Shimke Peretsky, it became Shimon Peres. If your name was Shlomo Gorinsky, you became Shlomo Goren, and so on and so forth. Your name was Levi, whatever, it became Levi Eshkol. None of these people were born with those names. Ben Gurion was not a being. If your name was Golda Meyerson, you became Golda Meir. So Bloch, like Hartov, the good rock. Anyway, so he was with his mother, Dora Bloch. And Dora Bloch was a 76-year-old woman. She got a piece of meat cut in her throat. And unfortunately, they couldn't get it out. And she, Thursday night, was transported to the hospital in Entebbe, to a hospital, to remove this meat. The head of the health ministry, who was a nice man, when he went to visit her on Friday to see what was going on with her, he went ahead and he said, "Why don't you stay over? Why don't you stay over till Shabbos?" She was there Thursday night. By Friday, she was ready to go back, but she was an old lady and didn't want her going back to the. By the way, it was terrible. It wasn't torturous, but it wasn't clean. The toilets weren't functioning. There were mosquitoes. It was hot. There were no clean sheets. So he let her stay over Friday night as well, an extra night, and he was supposed to have her return before 12 noon on Shabbos day, on Sunday, before 12 noon Sunday, but when he let her stay, when he let her stay that extra day, when they came in Motzei Shabbos, it was that night, must have been Friday she was taken, Friday she was taken, she stayed Friday night, and he said, you can stay over Shabbos till Sunday. Sunday, July 4th at 12, she had to be back under Idi Amin's orders, but by Friday at 12 midnight, that's when the Israelis landed, and she was left in the hospital. She was eventually murdered, 76-year-old murdered by Idi Amin. Believe it or not, he had her body dumped in an open field, where it basically remained until Idi Amin was deposed in 1978. In 1979, her body was actually returned to Israel, and she's buried, I believe, on Har HaMenuchos, where her remains still were extant and remained during that time period. She actually was on her way to go to her youngest son's wedding in New York. His name is Daniel Bloch, who's still alive. And her older son, Ilan Bloch, or Ilan Hartov, not only did he lose his mother, he was the one who claimed, by the way, in that famous interview, that they didn't separate Jew and non-Jew. He claimed that was not true. He claimed Israelis and then these 8 Orthodox Jews. Besides having his mother murdered by the henchmen of Idi Amin, unfortunately, some of you may remember, it was about, I don't remember, 10, 15 years, probably it was 2011. 2011 it was, there was a wedding hall in Talpiot in Yerushalayim called the Versailles Wedding Hall, which the dance floor collapsed, and 26 Jews, I believe, were killed. 26 dancing. People were killed. Even the Chas and Kala were injured. About 100 were injured. One of those killed was Hartov's daughter. Hartov's daughter, as a postscript, was killed in that. So you had Yoni Netanyahu dies in the military, either shot by one of the terrorists or shot by a Ugandan. Idi Amin always maintained it was a Ugandan because he awarded him some sort of Medal of Honor. Besides all 7 terrorists which were killed, anywhere from 25 to 45 Ugandan soldiers were killed. Once they started shooting, the backup force basically responded with heavy fire, killing any Ugandan soldier that moved. And they cleared the terminal, and before they took out the hostage, they killed any Ugandan soldier in the area. Anywhere from 25 to 45 soldiers, Ugandan soldiers were killed. The 7 terrorists were killed. And again, Ida Barakovich, Pascal Cohen, Jean-Jacques Maimoun, Dora Bloch, and Yoni Netanyahu was the only Israeli soldier killed. However, there was an Israeli soldier, Surin Hershko, a Sephardic Israeli soldier, who was shot in the neck by a Ugandan soldier, and he remains paralyzed, a paraplegic for life. He's still alive too. He was taken out. He also is a casualty, although he didn't die. At the time, then the hostages were put back on the plane, and they arrived back in Israel on Sunday. The whole thing, they were off the ground less than an hour. 59 minutes they were out of their back end, and everybody landed safely in Kenya. The planes were refueled, and within 2 hours of being in Kenya, all 5 planes, the 707, which treated some of the wounded, the 4 planes that landed in Uganda, they were all out already, heading back to Israel, and they arrived in Israel late Sunday afternoon, July 4th, which is why I still remember where I was. I was in summer camp in the mountains. I was 17 years old, I remember, and we all heard about probably 11 o'clock, 10 o'clock in the morning, we all heard the news. In America, on July 4th, I remember there was this big sail thing in New York. I forgot what it was called, Operation Sailors, I forgot what it was called. A big sail thing in New York, a lot of ships, big ships, on the New York Harbor. But the big news everyone was talking about was this miraculous mission. I just want to, and Baruch Hashem, Yitzchak Rabin asked his secretary to prepare a letter of resignation if the mission was a failure. When they asked him what would be a failure, he said if up to 25 people is a success, 25 or more would be a failure. And that's pretty unbelievable. So in that way, certainly it was a success, and certainly it was praised by the world, praised by the international community, praised by everybody. If I may, I just want to, before we conclude, I just want to bring you 2 halachic sources about Entebbe, which you may find fascinating. The first is in a very unlikely source. The first is in a sefer called Orchos Rabbeinu, Baal Hakilos Yaakov. This sefer is a very favorite sefer of mine. This sefer is 5 volumes. It's written by Rabbi Eliezer Horowitz, Rabbi Eliezer Halevi Horowitz, he basically hung around the Stipler and Reb Chaim Kanievsky for like 10 years, every single day. For like 10 years or so, he hung around mostly the Stipler and Reb Chaim Kanievsky a little bit too, and every day he wrote down what the Stipler did that day. And then he put it in a 5-volume book, and every day he tells you He then divided into halachic topics like Pesach, Sukkot, this. But really, he writes the day. This day I came at 10 o'clock in the morning, and the stipler looked tired. And I asked him, why are you tired? And he said, I was up the whole night learning. What were you learning? He was learning this, he was learning that. So he records the following. Yom Aleph Vav Tammuz. This is on that Sunday. Morei v'Rabbi Shlita Siperli, meaning he writes what the stipler even talked to him, Mili da Alma, meaning just down, the stipler schmoozed with him. He was like the stipler's friend. Even though he calls him Morei, so the stipler told him over, just talking. Stipler says, Mishahu, and then he writes parentheses. The stipler mentioned the guy's name, but he doesn't mention his name. Mishu bilbel li es harosh. Somebody was, as I would say, was hakami at Chainik. Somebody was bothering me that I, Vahagon Rab Leizer Shach Shlita, that me and Rav Shach Yelchu LeRabin, we should go to Rabin, he writes it as he spoke, Lehishtadel Sheyimsorm Bechablim Tumuras Hachatufim Beuganda, Kedrishas HaMechablim, Hachotfim. That we should go and tell Rabin, stop this silliness with how these people's lives are at stake. Go and tell him Das Torah tell Rabin that Das Torah dictates you have to give in to the demands and free the hostages. That's the proper way to do it. V'omer Moi v'Rebbe politika shall kol echad ma she'oleh b'daito mebalbal lanu es harosh. Meaning he said, everyone's a politician, everyone has the political thing, and they bother me about these things. V'rosh memshala yichchashev im shnei rabbanim zkenim. And do you really think that the Rosh Memshala cares about two old rabbis? And he says, Mikol atztadim loktzim al Rosh Memshala. V'gam anu nitapel elav. Everyone's bothering him. We should go too. Meaning he says it's ridiculous. And then he says in parentheses that Rav Shach anyway disagreed, wouldn't go. I don't know if that means he asked him. Anyway, then he went ahead and he talked a little bit halacha, and he thought that maybe you could do it. But then he talked to him in learning. And we once discussed it. There were two opinions. Maybe you could, maybe you can't. And he said actually that because that since we're dealing with them, maybe they'll take more hostages. Yesh kan shamechablim yichtafu od matosim. V'im yiru shalom nosnim lahem es tneihem yafsiku lachtof. Yiru shalom mishtalim lahem. But perhaps really the government is right, they're not giving in. Maybe that's better. And then he says, therefore, that the government has what to rely on. And then he went ahead and he says, so therefore, he thinks that it's okay that they go ahead and they don't necessarily negotiate with them. And he goes, what about its pikuach nefesh? So he says no, but he says that even pikuach nefesh, lemaisa amarli mori, that lemaisa that lememshala hanoketes emda sirav yesh tzad heter bahalacha. He says a government which holds that they shouldn't negotiate, there is a room in halacha to be matir that approach. The yesh poskim shemitzad in the halacha, the tam degarvid, you'll cause them. So he said halachically it's not even clear if they should or they shouldn't. Then, that was Sunday. Kishagati lemocharas baboke lemori v'rebi. When I got to the stipler Monday morning, kvar hayo la'achar pa'ulas hatzava mi Yisrael ba'unganda. That after they came v'shichru at the chatufim, they ran ahead and they freed the hostages. Umovi Rabbi Kfar Yodal zeh, and he said he got there, and he asked me, did they reach there? Did they get back to Israel yet? Umori v'Rebbe and the stipler samach ma'od al shichruram v'shibeach es hamishtacharim. And he praised the IDF for their military prowess. V'amar, listen carefully, very important. Sherak Yehudim misugalim la'sos pu'ula kazo shel mesiris nefesh. And the stipler said only Jewish people Only Jewish people are Mesugel, are able to be Moser Nefesh, that have to do such a thing. Amazing thing. Amazing thing. Source number 2, Silence and Shuvas Yabia Omer from Rav Ovadia Yosef. Now I have to admit, in all honesty, I have a question on this. The book is called Yabia Omer, which is his halachic work. When a book was originally published in the 1980s, it just says that Rav Ovadia Yosef was asked, what's the din of Uganda? What's the din? Should they go? Should they not? But in the last edition, it has the following. B'sasef am in gedole haTorah ladun b'nosei b'bechinas halacha. So Lamaisa, he says, he's mashma that they were asked to ask. Now listen to this. This is a footnote which only appears in the latest edition of Yabia Omer. If you have an old edition, you won't have this footnote. It's only from the latest edition. He says that a group of rabbis gathered to discuss this. Here's what he writes. V'yashavnu yakad im Hagon Reb Yosef El Yoshiv, Hagon Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Hagon Reb Betzalel Joti, Hagon Reb Eliyahu Goldschmidt, Hagon Reb Shol Yisraeli, Hagon Reb Ben Zion Abba Shol, V'zoi hachlota shehiskablu ba'oso mamad. Now, this is literally a who's who in Gedolei Yisrael at the time. Remember, this is talking about 1976, and again, the names didn't appear the first time the Sefer was published. You'll see why I'm mentioning that in a moment. Hovaru liyedias Rosh Memshala, and Lamaisa, that we therefore passed on to the Rosh Memshala, the halacha, Barur hadover sheshikr mechablim hanishrashim tomen bechovo sakanas rabos, biyos yudim chutiv neshini b'sakanas nefashis, lefi halacha sakanas shachotim machras esakanas. He paskins that since they're in pikuach nefesh, they should release the terrorists that are in prison for the sake of the hostages. Ulefichach ha-memshalas Yisrael likanes b'masu matan imachab l'asos hakol b'kdei l'atzil l'shu. He says they should do that. Hashem yeh be'ezraseinu l'shmoa en kasasir. And he says that that's what happened, and it's mashma from here that they sent this message to Rabin. Mashma, he asked them what the halacha is, and they sent this message that he should engage. Then he adds on. Again, like I said, it's a little bit clear, and I'm not going to, I know I'm on tape here, but I wonder if somebody, frankly, redacted some of it, because things, you'll see in a minute why things don't seem to 100% add up, but whatever it is, I'll read it as it is, and I'll tell you or at least maybe you can help me. Hisasef rosh im gedolei Torah ladun b'noseim b'cheres halacha. Now, in this thing, he says, now they're in the middle of the meeting. Maybe they were about to send the message to him. Maybe they hadn't sent the message. But this clearly states in this last edition that they're in the middle of the meeting. Ubetoch kidei hadiyunim, in the middle of the meeting, of the diyunim, of the meeting, Shisharu b'tzadei halacha, we discussed the halacha, Higia Rosh HaMemshala Mar Yitzchak Rabin Zichrono Levracha Eleinu. Rav Yosef, if this is true, if this is the way he writes it, he claims that Mr. Rabin Zichrono Levracha came to their meeting of these great rabbis, Ubise Lanu Esa Besora Hamarnina, and he told us this wonderful news. Shekvar Hitzlichu Anshe Tzahal Lechaselas HaMechablim HaRishoim, that Tzahal was able to kill off, neutralize these evil people, the Esos Re'em Uganda, and all that helped them in Uganda, Ulshachrer Esmeas HaChutufim HaYehudim, and they saved the Jews, Heim B'darkam L'Eretz Yisrael. The Rabin came into this meeting and he told them they're on their way home, And then he writes, Ravad Yosef switches to the poetic Ravad Yosef, Tihilos lekelba yisbarach, praise to Hashem, Asher higdil chasto niflosam, he gave us chesed, Ra'u kol asfei aretzes Yeshuas Elokeinu, the whole world saw the Yeshuas, Kol umas ha'olam hema ro, kein tamo, v'shtam al gvuras Yisrael, the whole world is astounded, is amazed, is literally, in awe of the gvura, of the strength of the Jewish people of Yisrael. Asher min neshorim kolo ma'aros gaveru, they're faster than eagles, they're stronger than lions. Higdilu lasos bez Hashem latzil lekuchim lemavis, they're able to save people from death. Hey me'as hachatufim, the 100 hasivim l'Yisrael berina v'simchas olam rosham, they brought them in peace and simcha. Ein matzor Hashem lo shia baral mot, there's no end to what Hashem can cause to be Yeshua. Podo matzil ki gavar aleinu chasto, Hashem's chesed overcomes us. Ve'emes Hashem lolam halaluka baruch hamakadosh shmo barabim, blessed is the Jewish people that they sanctified God's name barabim. So the only issue I have with this is that we're talking about that these rabbis, therefore, this is happening Motzei Shabbos. Now, Rabin doesn't know this happening till like it's 1 o'clock in the morning on Motzei Shabbos. It just seems a little strange to me that the plane is already gone. They left Saturday at 3:30. They knew they had to leave at 3:30. They got the final okay in the middle of the flight, because they left 3:30. By the time the meeting ended, it was like 4 o'clock. By the time they half hour into the flight, they got that they were cleared for the flight, but they took off anyway. They'd return back if they weren't cleared. It just seems a little strange to me. In Israeli time, the mission ends past midnight, which means Rabin doesn't even know, that they're not even on their way back to 12:30, 1 o'clock. It just seems a little strange that the first thing Rabin does, he's in Tel Aviv in the Kiryah, is to drive to Jerusalem, where all these great rabbis live. All these great rabbis are living in Jerusalem. But at 3 o'clock in the morning, they're still there, and I don't know. I wonder if it was a little poetic license taken here. Maybe they just got a phone call from a person who, I don't know, maybe representing Rabin. And also I have to admit that this is not printed in the list of rabbis. The who's who of rabbis, again, I don't recall ever seeing anywhere in print that these rabbis, not that God forbid they didn't get along, but they didn't necessarily travel in the same circles either. Especially Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who was known to be a very apolitical person who never involved himself in anything to do with rabbinate affairs. Never involved himself in rabbinical affairs, he was offered multiple times to be the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, of Israel, and he constantly, I'm not saying it's possible, but it just seems to me, perhaps, I don't, I can't, but I found that interesting. Okay, so the final word, obviously it was a big issue of Hashem. I do just want to add on, that, I think some of you know already, I've said this before, never say never, never say always. It certainly was a Yeshua, and certainly it could have ended a lot worse. Oh, by the way, that woman's name was Patricia Martel, that woman who was released to Israel. I just saw I wrote down her name. The first woman who got off in Benghazi, who faked the miscarriage. But I do want to say honestly that, in all truth, I don't know, at the end of the day, for Dora Bloch, for Pascal Cohen, for their family, for Jacques Moemun, I don't know, for them it wasn't such a happy day. Plus the idea, the myth of the crew was so heroic, was so steadfast in their allegiance. If indeed, as Saul David claims, which seems compelling, that that's not true, once again, I don't think I would necessarily act differently, but when we daven every morning, we talk about Yetzias Mitzrayim. All the Jews were saved at Yetzias Mitzrayim. And we say something like, Echad mehem lo nosar, and not one enemy survived. Meaning, ultimately, obviously, who we to judge? Yeah, I quoted you that the Stipler was happy. If the Stipler knew some people were killed, I don't know. If Rovad Yosef knew that some people were killed, I don't know. But, honestly, when one looks onward in history, almost 50 years later, unfortunately, it certainly was celebrated, and I imagine compared to what could have been a Ma'alot, it's certainly what to celebrate, but, unfortunately, it didn't really solve much. And I'm not, God forbid, saying that they did wrong. I'm not one to judge that. But ultimately, we're still in a position where, we desperately need Yeshuas Hashem. We're back now on Tisha B'Av Tafresh Pei Daled with 115 Jewish hostages, which we don't know their fate. And we're faced now with a position where, frankly, our enemies have upped the ante to ways we could never have imagined. And besides that, they learned ways of that soldiers are worth a lot more than civilians, as they proved with Gilad Shalit. Ultimately, the 48 years later, I'm not sure, not to God forbid say it wasn't a Yeshua, but I'm not sure the overall effect really impacted in a meaningful way to change the reality on the ground. Again, we live in Olam Hazeh, and Olam Hazeh has a lot of challenges, has things that we're sad about, like on Tisha B'Av, and things which are seemingly more easy to celebrate, like this mission. But in retrospect, it also, there are elements of a mixed bag here. There are elements. Looking back, would Israel really been humiliated? Would it cause more head kidnappings, more hostage taking? Who knows? It didn't seem to have stopped it either. Certainly did not seem to stop it. At the end of the day, I just want to, close with a personal reflection. If I can ask someone just to bring me a sitter, please. There's in the back of the room, there's a room there. If someone could just bring me one sitter. I just want to conclude. I just want to conclude with one just personal feeling, just personal note of my own Tisha B'Av of Tafshin Pei Daled. And of course, that's with the recognition and with the feeling, obviously, that whatever the Yeshuas Hashem are, we want more Yeshuas Hashem. Thank you, Danny, very much. Thank you. But I have to be honest with everybody now. I've often had a problem, I'm embarrassed to maybe, but at least I'm honest. I've often had a difficulty. I've often had a difficulty on Tisha B'Av of reciting this tefillah. It's a tefillah which is said only once a year. Not only is this tefillah only said once a year, it's only said one time in the year. One day of the year, and only once on that day. And that tefillah is called Nachem. Hashem, console. Nachem Hashem Elokeinu es Evlei Tzion. Hashem, console the mourners of Zion. Es Evlei Yerushalayim, and the mourners of Jerusalem. And here was the problem where I had problems. Es Ha'ir Ha'avela, the mourning city. Ha'chareva, the destroyed city. Ha'buzuyah, the one that's disgraced. Ha'shomema, that's desolate. Ha'avela mibli vaneha, which is mournful without its children. Ha'chareva mimenosea, it's destroyed of its living quarters. Ha'buzuyah mikvuda, it's disgraced from its honor. Hashomema me'ein yoshev, it's destroyed that no one lives there. Hi yosheves v'rosha chafui ki isha kara, she sits with head covered like a mournful widow. Shelo yalada, who never had children. V'yavlua legionos, and the legions attacked her. V'yeshuha ovdei zarim, and other people took hold of her, conquered her. Yatilu es amcha lecherev. They took your people to the sword, under the sword. Ve'argu b'zadon chasidei od. They killed holy people. Al-Kain Tzion b'mar tivke Tzion cries out, Yerushalayim titen kola, Yerushalayim gives out its voice. Libi, libi al chalaleihem. My heart goes out to the ones who were killed, the victims. May I al chalaleihem. My innards call out. Ata Hashem be'esh hatzasa, you came the fire, u'be'esh ata asid livnosa, and the fire you rebuilt Jerusalem. Kamor ani ayelach num Hashem chomas eish aviv. I'll one day have a fire, a wall of fire surrounding you. L'chavod yeh besocha, you'll be Hashem's honor will shine within you. Blessed are you, Hashem, menachem Tzion. You bring solace to Tzion, ubona, and you rebuild Yerushalayim. The difficulty I always had in this tefillah is that Jerusalem is not destroyed. Jerusalem is not disgraced. Jerusalem is not desolate. Jerusalem is not Me'ein Yoshev. Baruch Hashem, it's not. But I have to admit, when I read these words today, Kfar Aza is Me'ein Yoshvei. Nobody is living there anymore. And all the other kibbutzim, whose names I don't remember, they are Shomei Ma Me'ein Yoshev. And for almost 48 hours, a big swath of Israel was Yeshua Ovdei Zarim. Foreigners took over the land, unbelievably. In our time, in the modern state of Israel, swaths of the country was occupied by occupiers, by evil people. And they took our people b'cherev. They killed our people in the most disgusting, maniacal, savage way. Chasidei Elyon, holy people. Do you know how many frum people or people who grew up in Hasidic and Haredi homes were killed in the Nova? You know how many kids from Haredi homes, Hasidic homes? You know how many families the Gera community, the Belz community, the Breslov community lost in the Nova event? More than you want to know. Not that from Tel Aviv homes they're any less precious. Not that they're any less precious. Plenty of people who grew up in frum homes and in non-frum homes. Yes, thankfully it wasn't Yerushalayim. But who would have believed? I always had a difficulty reciting this tefillah. But who knows? Maybe when we said Avleit Zion, we mean Zion as the country. And when we say Ha'ir, maybe we really mean Kfar Aza. And all those cities now that are desolate, Metula, Kiryat Shmona, who knows? So Baruch Hashem, we've seen Hashem's hand bring Yeshuas, but unfortunately we're still in a very difficult position. May the bracha of Nachem be fulfilled in our time, that we're zocher, we're privileged, that this should be the last Tisha B'Av we ever have to commemorate, and that the words of the tefillah that we said today at Mincha should be fulfilled, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will rebuild, that it'll be an Eish Aviv, a fire of honor, l'chavod, and Hashem's honor will shine forth from Yerushalayim. Please, Baruch Atah Hashem, Hashem, you are blessed. You're the only one who can really be Menachem Tzion, who can really bring a Nechama to Tzion. And you're the only one who can be Bona Yerushalayim. May it come speedily in our days, B'mhera v'yameinu. Amen.